"Stop, don't sign! It's a trap!" The words cut through the hush of the great study like a thrown stone. Paper trembled, a pen rolled to the edge of the polished desk. In the cavernous room, under the soft sheen of crystal chandeliers, the suddenness of a child's voice sounded obscene, too raw, too urgent, for an afternoon given over to legalities and smiles that never reached the eyes. Lara stood in the doorway, small against oak and marble, knuckles white on a scrap of paper she had seized. Her breath came quick, a tight animal sound. The document in her hands, a stack of pages in a stiff leather folder, split with the sound she hated most, the soft, brutal tearing of paper. Marcos's hand shot forward like a viper. "Get her out! Security!" Amanda rose, a shape of silk and calculated fury, eyes narrowed into a smile that never touched her face. "Who let—" Her voice died when she saw the look on Sandra's face. The old woman's fingers, fragile and thin in the tremor of age, hovered over the pen as if it were a precipice. Sandra's eyes, cloudy and unclear for months, found Lara's like a lantern finding a moth. For a second there was a childlike brightness, recognition, a softness that dissolved the years between them. Then the light flickered. The old woman collapsed like a house of cards folding inward. Her chair toppled, the pen skittered across the floor and stopped under the velvet rope that separated the legal world from the heart. Someone shouted for a doctor. Someone else barked into a phone. The chandeliers hummed above, indifferent, while a crowd of polished shoes converged into a knot of panic. Lara didn't wait to be thrown out. She clutched the torn pages to her chest and fled through the back corridor she'd come by. The servants' wing, where air smelled of lemon polish and fried onions, where shadows were friends and doors sometimes left ajar. Her small feet hit the stone with a rhythm she belonged to, the city's heartbeat. She knew every service door by memory, every loose hinge, every smell that marked the passage. Behind her, the shouts spooled into the distance, into the mottled grey of rain that had started to stitch the afternoon sky. At the gate, she stumbled. A wallet, thin and scuffed, skittered from the hand of someone who had bumped her in the rush and came to rest almost at her feet. Inside, a faded photograph fluttered out and landed on the wet pavement face up. For a second, Lara could have sworn she'd seen that face before. The curve of a cheek, a baby in someone's lap, a woman with hair the color of ash leaning over them both. Her fingers closed over the picture like a tide pulling the ocean back. At the corner, under a sputtering street lamp, Ottavio was waiting as if he'd been carved out of the night itself. He had the slow gait of someone who'd learned to move around the world quietly, to be useful without being noticed. He always smelled faintly of oil and coffee. When he saw Lara, the corners of his mouth lifted with a tenderness that was almost a secret. "You did good," he said, lowering his voice, though no one had asked him to. He tipped a hand into his jacket, and an old photograph slid from his palm. The same one that had fluttered from the wallet, only this time larger, worn at the edges. "Thought you'd need it back." Lara blinked. The photograph warmed in her fingers. It showed a woman. There was no mistaking that hair, the slope of her nose, holding a toddler with a smudged cheek. Behind them, a younger Sandra watched with something like hunger for the light. On the back, in a neat, looping hand, someone had written a date and a name, Carla, a note, "Don't forget." Ottavio's face hardened into the precise private expression he wore when he kept a truth for too long. "They'll tell you to stay away," he said. "They'll say it's not your place." He paused, watching the rain stitch patterns across the street. But truth don't care what they say. Somewhere behind them, an ambulance siren screamed, then dissolved. Lara wrapped her fingers again around the photograph, like it could anchor her to an identity that had been fraying for years. She had lived enough nights under bridges, behind bakery doors, and in the space between two dumpsters to know what it was to be invisible. Sandra had been a light that learned to notice her. "If you're rooting for Lara, Hit like and subscribe to follow what happens next. They said, those who knew the right people and the right cocktails, that Sandra Almeida had always preferred small gestures to grand announcements. A slice of cake left on a windowsill, the kind of wool scarf that smelled like lavender, a 10-minute visit in the park where she'd sit and feed pigeons with a child who had oily palms and a grin too quick for her age. People loved the story because it fit a comfortable shape. A lonely billionaire with softened edges, a stray child who found a home, newspaper columns like neat fairy tales. Sandra had liked Lara the way some people heat their hands over a candle, careful, grateful, protective. Lara remembered the day Sandra first slipped her a buttered roll at the diner, the warm square of bread that felt like winter, the way Sandra's gloves were embroidered with initials in a hesitant hand. The memory came back like a taste. Lara was 7 then, hair tangled against the collar of a too-big jacket, knees grazed, eyes hard with the watchfulness of survival. Sandra had tapped the rolled paper into Lara's palm as if she didn't want to draw attention. "Eat," she said, and the word was a blessing. "You look like you could use a friend." Ooh. Over time, the visits patterned themselves into a secret, then a public wonder. Sandra would come, sometimes with wrapped bits of clothing, other times with nothing more than a story. The staff were told to be gentle. The drivers were told to smile, but not pry. To journalists, she said in a silvered voice that Lara was her granddaughter by choice, an adopted daughter of the heart. And the world accepted it, because the line made for pretty headlines. It was a label that settled over Lara like a warm coat, adopted granddaughter. Not legal papers, not yet. But the name mattered. It offered a claim that a street name could not. There were reasons, practical and private, why Sandra had not signed any formal adoption papers. Age made legalities brittle. Cloudy moments made signatures suspect. And there were calculations the family preferred to keep between themselves, behind curtains and ledgers. Publicly, though, Sandra arranged for a portrait. Lara's hair brushed, her jacket replaced with a cardigan, and the caption read, "My granddaughter." For a while, the photograph was enough. Lara learned manners on the street, but she learned tenderness from Sandra. The old woman treated her like someone whose existence mattered to the architecture of a life. She would tell Lara stories of a house with a kitchen that never cooled, of bowls heaped with oranges, and the idea of permanence seeped into Lara's dreams like light into a closed room. The picture in Ottavio's hand, the photo of Carla smiling with a baby, was a piece of that room Lara had never fully entered. The name on the back, the slanted hand, whispered of a woman she remembered as both light and loss. Carla's absence had been a hole with its own sound. At first the memory was a smell, boiling lemons, the faint sting of salt from tears, the metallic hum of a radiator. Then it was a set of images that broke apart and reassembled, a laugh cut off by a shout, a suitcase abandoned by the door, the slam of a taxi pulling away. Lara had been old enough to feel frightened, and small enough to still imagine that someone would come back with a bundle and a smile. She waited. She did not know then how some people disappear because they need to protect more than themselves, because they are swallowed by a system of fear that hides them under numbers and appointments. Marcos had a presence that took up air. He moved through rooms as if he believed in the rightness of his claims, and those who knew him only superficially mistook confidence for conviction. He was a man who grew angrier as his world got smaller. Wealth had given him habits, sharp suits, sharper words, but it had never taught him how to sharpen the parts of himself that could have cut ties instead of people. Amanda, the younger daughter, had the same eyes as her father, calculated, lit by the idea that everything could be negotiated if you had the stubbornness to press the point. When Sandra's health had begun its slow, whispering decline, the family's conversations shifted. They took place in corners, in whisper, with coffee gone cold. "We have to move the estate division forward," Marcos said one afternoon, tapping a pen against a piled folder meaty with legal paper. She's wandering more. The doctors say she forgets names. There's a window. Amanda smiled as if offering a gift. We consult the attorney next week. A temporary transfer, powers of attorney, until she's lucid again. It's standard. They called it care. They polished the phrase until it sounded reasonable. They circled the word interim like a landing spot. Somewhere in those murmurs, the phrase, "we'll manage the assets," grew teeth. Lara had been listening for weeks. She heard the strange cadence of their plotting, the way they used legal-smelling words to hide the cruelty of a plan. She'd crept along the high corridors of the house, a shadow with a name, slipping into the spaces between staff schedules and the slumber of chandeliers. Servants rarely bothered her if she kept to the wings. Sometimes they left plates behind. Sometimes they simply looked the other way. The house had corridors that smelled like lemon oil and old books. It had a servant's staircase where dust slept, and attic doors that refused to be quite shut. It was in that attic, after she'd climbed on tiptoe between boxes of stockings and a trunk that smelled of mothballs, that Lara had found a small book wedged behind a loose floorboard. The cover was a softened leather, the edges eaten by time. The loop of the binding had kept the pages safe, as if the book itself had been waiting. "Dear Diary," the first page read in a careful hand that was not quite like Sandra's public voice. The handwriting was smaller, intimate. Little notes fell down the page. The day a baby was left at the kitchen door. The fear that some men had. The names that slid across the margins like little witnesses. The diary was not a legal document. It was a place where Sandra, when she was awake and brave, had kept pieces of life that the world wanted to burn. One page had a line that stopped Lara's breath. "If they ever try to take her, look under the loose floorboard by the trunk. There's a photograph. Keep it safe." She buried that page into her coat. It was dangerous to be found with anything belonging to the family. To have proof was to have a target. Yet proof was a kind of armor too. In the photo was a woman who stared out as if she had known sorrow too early, and a baby with a cheek smudged by jam, and behind them, as if the scene were arranged by fate, Sandra's hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers like a promise. Lara had not known the woman's name then. Later, when the name Carla came to her, spoken by a nurse in the low way people speak about the past, it landed like a bell. Otavio had given her the rest of the map to the past. He'd worked nights in the service quarters, been eyes on the stairs, fingers in pockets that had been left open after parties. He was patient as a slow tide in speaking of what he'd seen. "They never liked Carla," he said one night, when the rain made the city smell of copper. "She was too brave for them, said things, looked at the family the wrong way. You know how those sorts of people get noticed." It was enough to draw the line between what had been comfortable for others and what had been dangerous for the mother who had once hummed lullabies into Lara's hair. The line was a knife, Carla's courage and Marcos's anger. The house was full of secrets, and those secrets had teeth. After the tearing in the study, after Sandra's collapse, the staff scattered like papers in a draft. Lawyers barged into hallways, faces tight with obligation. The media would soon orbit the house, smelling blood in the form of a scandal. But Lara had slipped away into the rain, and into the shelter of someone who had always known how to be in places no one else could find. She went, as she always did, to the diner where she had first met Sandra. The owner, a woman with hands that smelled of cinnamon, wrapped a sandwich in a napkin and handed it over without questions. The television behind the counter flickered with the news. Breaking: billionaire Sandra Almeida collapses during meeting. Family in disarray. Bulletins like this pulled at the edges of Lara's life, as if she were an ornament hanging on the world's cold branch. She tucked the photograph into the inner pocket of her jacket and fingered it until the paper grew soft. In the photograph, Carla's eyes had been full and fearless. Lara had never thought of herself as a child who could inspire claim on a fortune. Survival had been a currency, and she'd spent it carefully. But the idea that there might be a bridge back, proof, witnesses, people who had not yet been silenced by fear, made a warmth spread behind her ribs. When Sandra was taken to the hospital, it was under the polite authority of paramedics and a flurry of concern that smelled, to Lara, a lot like calculated haste. On television, studio anchors spoke in syllables polished by practice. Her family will issue a statement. Concerns about competency. Legal experts suggest immediate conservatorship. In the meantime, in the grey of the city, March's plan continued. He smiled at reporters who clucked with the same astonishment people reserve for storms. "We are doing what's best for Mother," he said. "We will make sure her wishes are respected." Amanda leaned in and whispered about timelines and signatures. They were already measuring the hours as if they were inches of cloth to be cut. Lara learned the word signature meant not just a line, but a doorway. If the wrong hand could be convinced to sign, or coerced, or tricked, then what had been a home could become a ledger. Sandra's vulnerability had been assessed with an efficiency that made Lara sick. She had seen the way men like Marcos measured breathing as if it could be tallied. She thought of the diary in the attic, of the loose floorboard and the photograph. She thought of Ottavio's slow, faithful face. She thought of Carla, once whole, then gone. That night, when the house was a silhouette against the city, Lara crept back through the side door with Ottavio's help. He led her to a door that whispered on its hinges and to the stair that only the night staff used. She moved like a memory. The air inside the house smelled of lemon oil and old money. It felt wrong and also right in a way that pricked her with complicated longing. In the attic, the trunk was exactly where the diary had pointed. The loose floorboard made a small, hollow sound when she tapped it with the heel of her hand. The photograph was taped with an old yellowing scotch and written on in a hand that slanted like a secret. On the back, in addition to the name, someone had written a single word that felt like a promise. Return. At the edge of the floorboard, tacked to the underside of a beam, was a folded scrap of paper. Lara unfolded it with hands that trembled. The paper was smaller than her palm, and the writing on it was hurried, as if the person who had scrawled it had been interrupted. "Don't trust the appointment for today. Keep watch." Oh. It took a moment for the letter to sink in. Oh, it could only be Ottavio. He was the only one who called people by single letters. The handwriting matched a scrawl Lara had seen in the margins of the extra bills he kept in his locker. Someone was watching. Someone was trying to warn them. Lara's heart beat against her ribs like a caged bird. She pressed her forehead to the cool wood beams and looked out through the small attic window at the shape of the city, black and sleep-pricked. The house below, so sharp and lacquered, hid corridors where decisions were made and signatures were forged. Her chest tightened. If she let them sign, the house, and perhaps anything that might still belong to her, would be fenced off with lawyers like sentries. She made a decision then, the way children make decisions. Suddenly, with a clarity, adult fear had smudged from her. She would not let them. The next morning the house smelled of coffee and a cautious kind of civility. Lawyers arrived with tablets and binders. There was an aura of destiny around the legal table, as if the trembling old woman and the folder on the desk were an arrangement set by gravity. Sandra sat propped in a chair, her hair carefully combed, a pale scarf knotted around her throat. There were attendants to hold cups and hands. She looked smaller than the house. The room felt like theatre. Cameras would not be allowed in. The press would be sent statements later, but presence felt inevitable. The idea of normalcy had creases that needed pressing. Marcos sat nearest the table, hands folded as if in prayer. Amanda hovered at the edge like a moth. The lawyer, a man with grey temples that gave him the colour of old paper, tapped a pen against his folder before dipping it into a glass of water. "If you are ready, Mrs. Almeida," he said, his voice the product of 1,000 settled disputes. "The document requires only your signature to transfer—" "That is a document that will bind the history of this family," Marcos cut in smoothly. He leaned forward, the smile of someone offering a final, inevitable gift. Lara slipped into the back hall, ducking under the portrait gallery that the family used for posture and PR. She had managed to get in. She'd learned when drivers came in the wrong doors and which staff took their coffee on the north terrace. The servants were distracted, attention given to comfort and to avoiding their own perilous place within the narrative unfolding. Lara watched from the threshold, a shadow among portraits of stern faces. The room smelled of lemon and old paper and candle wax. Her hands were damp inside her sleeves. She could see Sandra's fingers pale, a tremor in them. She saw the pen move, an armoured piece of ink waiting for the mark that would seal the house. Lara moved before she thought. She had the diary page in her pocket, the photograph pressed like a charm. Her feet were small and sure on unfamiliar floors. The legal table was a world apart, but the paper seemed alive in her hands. "Stop! Don't sign! It's a trap!" she shouted, the words raw and bright in the hush. Time folded. The pen stopped. The lawyer's face drained. Marcos lunged. Amanda shrieked something about trespassers and lunatics. It was exactly the sound Lara had feared, the collective inhalation of people who believe that presence equals threat. Sandra's eyes opened, and for a beat they were clear enough to be dangerous, clear enough to show that she saw. Then the world tilted. Sandra swayed. The chair fell back. A wave of hands rose into panic. Someone called for a doctor. The luxury of the afternoon collapsed into private, urgent mess. A table lamp toppled. Glasses rattled. A paperclip clinked like a small bell. Lara, terrified, felt the room close like a mouth. She had hoped to stop the signature, to tear the paper and hold something that might be evidence. She had not meant for the old woman to go down. Sirens were a mile away, and then too close. Paramedics swallowed the room into clinical gestures. They asked questions to people whose words were floral arrangements concealing knives. They took Sandra on a gurney, straps cold against the old woman's wrists, her scarf fluttering like a secret gone loose. Lara ran again. This time she did not go toward the alley, but toward the lurching, uncertain refuge of the world she had always known. She moved with the wind, with rain, with the ache that had hollowed her since she was old enough to remember. By the side of the diner, beneath the orange awning that smelled of coffee and lemon, Ottavio waited. He had a look in his eye, like a man who had expected accidents and hoped for miracles. He folded a paper into his palm and pushed it into Lara's hand. A business card, a scrap with a phone number. "Call if you need a place," he said. "Or I'll come looking." She did not have a place. But she had the photograph, the diary page, the knowledge that someone in the house had written, "Oh." In the hospital the room smelled like antiseptic and the tired goodwill of people trained to sleep with the idea that they were making things right. Sandra's name flashed on a monitor in small, steady blips. A doctor, courteous, plain-spoken, kept the language clinical. "She experienced syncope. Will monitor cognitive response. At the moment we can't determine competency for legal decisions." Competency. Lara tasted the word. It meant hands moving to fill gaps. It meant people like Marcos waiting with papers. It meant the world rearranging itself around a vulnerability that could be exploited. The family arrived, 12 faces in controlled grief. Marcos stood by Sandra's bedside, fingers pressed thin into the sheet. Amanda hovered near the door. They offered perfunctory kisses and measured tears. They arranged themselves around her like props, perfect, rehearsed, unreadable. And then, like a footprint appearing in soft earth, a presence Lara had not expected pushed into the room. Ottavio, shoulders hunched, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. He set it gently on a small side table and, when no one was watching, slid a faded photograph toward the nurse, who was scribbling notes. The nurse glanced at the photo, an image of Carla, young, hair pulled back, holding a small baby with a jam-smeared cheek. Behind them, Sandra's hands rested on a table as if to claim them both. The nurse's pen stilled. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. Ottavio looked at Sandra lying there, a pale island under hospital light. "It's been hidden in the house," he said. "There's a diary, too. Pages that might explain things, might show—" His voice broke a little on the last word. This was the sort of crack that can let light in, or let cold. The nurse did not ask which. She only tucked the photograph into the chart. Marcos's expression darkened. "Who told you to bring that?" His voice was small, a venom suited to the corridors where money and shame meet. Ottavio's face was an island of mild defiance. "No one told me," he said. "I kept it in case somebody needed to see the truth." Carla's name, when spoken in the clinic's soft echo, had a ripple that moved across the room. It was a name that sounded familiar to ears that had not heard it in years, a name that could fold the past into the present. Moments later, as if drawn by some slow magnetism, a woman in a faded coat entered the waiting area, like someone reappearing after being erased. She moved with small, careful steps. Her eyes traversed the room as if remembering maps. When they found Sandra, they fixed on each other with a recognition that was both intimate and dangerous. Carla looked half-dazed, like someone who'd been underwater and had only just nose-dug for air. Her hands shook, a tremor that had nothing to do with age. "Sandra," she whispered, her voice a thread. For a second, no one moved. Then Mars, an orderly who had been leaning over the coffee machine, stiffened. Ottavio was suddenly at Carla's side. He took her elbow with a steadied hand and led her toward the bed. Carla's face opened like a door. "My baby," she said. She said it as if the word were a password that should have unlocked a home, as if saying it might reroute how the world fit together. What followed was a small rustling of disbelief. "But how? Have you been—" Carla did not answer the questions that arrived like staccato punches. Instead, she let her hand brush Sandra's knuckles, and then photograph, then the air. She bent close to the old woman and whispered something that the nurse could not catch. In the hallway, Ottavio pulled Lara gently aside. "She remembers someone," he said. "Maybe a name. Didn't you hear? Ever so slight." Lara's chest stung. The little flame of hope that had lived in her for months surged like a candle struck to the light. If Carla could remember, if even a single fact returned, then the crooked lines of the present might be smoothed with evidence and faces, and a truth that could not be boxed. But the house did not surrender its secrets easily. Marcos and Amanda were already talking to the hospital administrator, smoothing their story into authoritative corners. Lawyers favored the edges like birds. There were focused looks exchanged, hands that folded into vested sleeves. They had plans. They were practiced at turning care into control. Lara watched Carla move slowly toward a chair by the window, a place of small sunlight that made the dust look gilded. The woman's eyes had a dew of confusion. They were not fully awake to memory, but not fully blank. She stared at a patch of wallpaper, as if its floral pattern might tell her a story. Ottavio bent down so his voice could be small and solid. "You remember," he said, as if reminding her of the facts of the world. "You were at the house long ago. You left because you were afraid." Carla's lips moved. A syllable surfaced and then dissolved. "He," she said, then stopped. The word didn't land fully. It trembled. He hurt." She clamped a hand over her mouth and shuddered, the action raw and private. Lara's throat tightened at the sound. She could not press the moment to itself. There were walls of social training that would make others look away at any mention of past pain. But for Lara, for the first time in a long while, pain had a name that did not only belong to her. It belonged to someone else who had been brave enough to have a child, be frightened, and perhaps forced away. Across the room, Marcos pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer with a voice meant for neutral tones. Amanda covered a slight flicker of nervousness with a laugh clipped and sharp. The legal machinery was already moving, as if the small personhood of a hospital room were an engine to be started. And as it moved, Lara felt, with a child's direct logic, that if Sandra recovered enough to sign, the work she had done, diary found, photograph displayed, would be undone by busy hands and smooth words. It would be like sweeping crumbs under a rug and calling the floor clean. There were things that needed witnesses, papers that needed to be preserved, an archive that needed to be made of the truth before it could be argued. The diary needed to be read aloud. The photograph needed to be notarized. Someone needed to testify that the woman who had been pushed into absence had belonged in ways that could be shown to other people, people who loved her and knew her. Ottavio, always a man of small, steady movements, had a plan that was small and steady as well. "There are people who keep things," he said to Lara, voice down. "Old gardeners, old maids who saw her with a baby, the keeper who used to sweep the balcony. He has a ledger with names. We ask them. We gather what we can. If they bring the law tomorrow, we bring witnesses." Lara's jaw worked. She had never been a person invited to organize. She had been someone who had to count on luck and quickness. But there was a courage that lived in the small, picking up a photograph, remembering a sentence from a diary, standing in front of a table to rip a page away. She felt it like a pulse. Carla's eyes fluttered, and she mouthed a word again, more clearly this time. "Lara." The sound broke something open. Lara, who had been braced for denial and dismissal, felt her knees go light. The room tilted in the positive way that sometimes happens when the world gives you what you long for without permission. But the day had teeth. As staff filed quietly in and out, as lawyers refined the corners of a narrative they preferred, as the city's noise seeped into the hospital's antiseptic walls, there was a pressure that built in the small, private corners where decisions are made by those with money and a practiced hand. Marcos's attorney came and whispered and wrote a list of requirements. The hospital would obey the law's bland cadence. Whether it would be wielded kindly or like a knife depended on the clarity of evidence and the weight of witnesses. Lara squeezed the photograph until the edges were soft. The knowledge that Carla had said her name, however tentative, was a kind of map. It told her where to begin. It told her that if the right people were found, if the diary's pages were read aloud and the photo was shown, the thin argument of a signature might unravel. Yet nights would stretch like stretched rubber between now and the court, between the hospital bed and the meeting table where pens waited with the patience of predators. There would be time for the family to marshal their resources, for Marcos to lubricate legal doors. There would be time for people to be tired and for memory to be explained away as confusion and for the word competence to be used like a bludgeon. The photograph burned, its small heat like a promise in Lara's jacket. She thought of the diary page, keep it safe. Of Ottavio's letter, don't trust the appointment. She thought of Sandra's fingers, of their tremor, and of the way the chandelier had shivered when the paper had torn. Outside the hospital, rain had stopped. The street glinted, washed. Inside, a small plan began to thread itself together. Witness, diary, photograph, presence. Collect what proves. Protect the woman who had been called grandmother by public and prospectively by law. The thought steadied her. In the night that followed, Lara sat on the diner's vinyl stool and watched the world rearrange itself into quiet. In the night that followed, Lara sat on the diner's vinyl stool and watched the world rearrange itself into quiet. The fluorescent light hummed above like a thought left unfinished. She nursed a half-eaten sandwich, fingers sticky with jam, the photograph folded against her ribs like a secret talisman. Around her, the city breathed. Delivery trucks sighed. Someone laughed too loudly at a corner phone. A stray radio played a half-remembered song. The night felt both huge and small enough to hide inside. Ottavio sat across from her, elbows on the formica, his fingers wrapped around a paper cup as if it were a compass. He spoke in the soft way people spoke when they were making lists in their heads and needed to set each item down aloud to see its weight. "We start with people who still remember," he said. "The ones who don't profit from lying. The people who won't be bought by a name." Lara traced the photograph's worn edge. Who remembers Carla?" she asked. The name had landed inside her the way sunlight lands on a closed room, slowly, then with a stubborn insistence. Ottavio's mouth tightened. The old gardener, Paolo. He kept a ledger of deliveries, flowers, bread, uniforms, the woman who did the laundry before they moved to that agency, Rosa, and Mrs. Figuera, the cook who left because she was tired of looking at Marcos's face. They made a list on a greasy napkin. Names that meant little on their own now wore small crowns. Paolo, Rosa, Mrs. Figuera, the night porter who had a habit of sleeping by the back stairs, a retired chauffeur who sometimes kept ledgers of his own, things he owned only because his wife told him to keep them. Each person was a thin thread. Together they might hold the fabric. The next morning scraped at the horizon. Lara needed to be back at the house before the lawyers returned for their next neat gestures. Proof needed to be secured in ways that couldn't be swept away. Ottavio had a map of the city in his head. Which alley smelled of coriander? Which market closed at noon, where a man would nap and no one would think to look for him? He moved with cautious apprenticeship, a man who had practiced staying out of sight until the day he had decided not to. They split up. Lara went to the market, where Paolo sat under a lemon tree selling potted geraniums with a gentleness that made customers buy more than they needed. He recognized her at once, the child who always stole an orange peel when no one watched. His hands were soil-stained, the nails rough as ledger pages. "My girl," he said, as if greeting a relative, though their kinship had been made of small favors and warm eyes. He listened without interjection as Lara pressed the photograph into his palm. His brow folded, then unfolded, like someone remembering the steps to a dance. "There's a ledger in the shed," he said finally. "Names, deliveries, the day they took her, there's a note. I thought better of saying anything then." He looked away as if even the sunlight could be abrasive. "I kept it. They don't come by as much anymore." Lara felt the world tilt, not proof yet, but a direction. Ottavio went to the laundry quarters and found Rosa folding a sheet with the kind of concentration that made time stop. Her hands remembered how to iron out creases the way other people remember a hymn. At the sight of the photograph, her eyes went glossy. "Carla's boy used to bring her coffee," she said, voice low. "I always thought she was a bright woman. She spoke about walking with a child. She told me once that the house smiled at her. Mrs. Figuera, the old cook, smelled of onions and rosemary when they found her. She had the kind of memory that kept people alive because she insisted the past be warmed on the stove until it tasted like truth. I saw Marcos shout," she said, setting a cup down as if it were a platter of evidence. He was jealous of the love, the way she looked at the child. He didn't like what couldn't be owned. Each testimony was a small, steady drop. Alone, they might be dismissed. Together, they could become a pool deep enough for the police to step into. But people who conspire do not always rely solely on legal angles. They use impatience and exhaustion as tools. Marcos, when he found himself thwarted by a torn page in a study and the collapse of a carefully placed meeting, moved with the tidy cruelty of someone who could call in favors. Amanda worked the press, softening their edges with cultivated sorrow. Marcos nudged accounts, whispering into the ears of men who wanted to hear only the things that benefited them. That afternoon, as Ottavio met the retired chauffeur near a tram depot and Lara collected the gardener's ledger, a shadow passed through the diners of small allies. Someone watched them, sometimes from a window, sometimes under the eave of a doorway. Once, a delivery truck that should not have been there backed into the alley and idled as if waiting for orders. A man in a dark jacket made eye contact with Lara and then looked away. She learned the vocabulary of being observed, the way a person's shoulders shift when they carry news that is not theirs to keep. They took the ledger, the laundry receipts, the faded envelope with a bus stamp dated the week Carla disappeared, and the photograph to the nurse who had first paused when Ottavio slid the image across her clipboard. Her name was Mariana. She had a way of writing down things with a pen that left no room for sentiment. Clinical, yes, but also precise. She tucked the items into a hospital folder and agreed to act as a witness to their existence. "Keep everything in one place," she said, surprising them with a practical warmth. "Scan what you can. I'll keep the originals in my locker. Do not let them be alone in a drawer." Her locker, a small metal island in the hospital's back corridor, was a kind of safe for desperate things. Ottavio and Lara left documents there like offerings. The nurse became more than a keeper. She became a point of contact for officers who were not yet ready to make a move. It took 3 days to gather what felt like a map, receipts with dates that matched notes in the diary, a gardener's ledger that listed Carla, 2 loaves, 2304, a bus ticket stub with the same month scrawled crookedly, and, among the diary's pages, a line that suggested what had happened when Carla tried to leave. The sentence was small. "He came for me at the market and said I belonged to the house now." The voice on the page was faint, but it pointed like a compass. Ottavio had another plan that lived in quieter places, the cameras in the service corridors. The mansion hadn't been built with malicious modernity in mind, but it had a wired eye the servants called the manager's watch. A sympathetic night porter, an old man named Anselmo, knew how to work the tapes. He would pull the reel and hand over hours of footage that showed hands, not faces. The passing of a wallet, a car backing into a garage at midnight. Visual breadcrumbs that, when combined with the diary, the photograph and witnesses, formed a line the police could follow. But acquiring footage meant someone needed to be inside the house again. Lara had learned the geography of service entrances, the creak of the 3rd stair, the way the attic smell changed with rain. She knew risks. Fear tasted like metal, but fear was also a tool, if you could keep it close enough to sharpen your moves. So she went back. That night, the house was less formidable in the small hours when its family did not occupy it. The chandeliers were off, the marble cooled like the inside of an uninhabited shell. Lara slipped through the servant's door and up the stairs, Ottavio having knocked on the door as a distraction and then moved out of sight like a shadow that had never been human. The law had schedules. The law had hours. Crime had quieter ones. Inside the attic, she found not only the diary, but a corner she hadn't explored. Boxes that smelled of lavender and a trunk with her name on it in someone's memory. She found a letter, edges foxed, tucked inside a sock, a note from Carla to Sandra pleading with her not to be alone with Marcos. "If anything happens," it read, "go to the old gardener. He remembers. He will tell you where to look." A map of names, a stitch of safe places. When Lara slipped the letter into her pocket, she heard steps on the stair. For a moment the attic held its breath. A figure passed beneath the window. One of the housekeepers, perhaps. Then silence again. Lara stayed as long as she dared, taking photographs with her phone, copying lines from the diary onto paper. She pressed her hand to the trunk's lid and felt the roughness of existence like a pulse. The following morning, The police finally arrived. They did not come with the rapid flourish of dramatic television. They came in pairs, polite, with notebooks and badges, and a weariness that suggested a long apprenticeship in listening to grief. The lead officer, a woman named Inspector Salgado, had small, sharp eyes and a kindness that made people want to tell the truth even when it hurt them. She read the diary pages, glanced at the ledger, looked at the photographs, and then removed her glasses as if to see better. "There's enough here to open an inquiry," she said in a tone that was not celebratory but clear. "We'll need statements. Witnesses will need protection. We'll approach the prosecutor." When the arrest came, it was not televised. It was procedural and careful. Marcos was taken from his study, still attempting to arrange a face that said dignity rather than panic, cuffed with the clumsy politeness of men who had believed themselves untouchable. Amanda's bedroom door was ajar when officers knocked. She answered in a nightdress, eyes red but not surprised. She had always believed that money could smooth the sharpest corners. Arrest left little smooth. There was no dramatic showdown at the house, because the most dangerous battles often happen on paper. Subpoenas, lists of witnesses, court dates arrived like bureaucratic tidal waves. The charges were formal: conspiracy to defraud, and, crucially, evidence dug up by the inquiry suggested a prior violent act connected to the time of Carla's disappearance, sufficient, when pieced with testimony and documents, to bring charges of attempted murder. The police had found receipts for hospital visits and an old ambulance call that corresponded to the night Carla vanished. Names on a ledger matched entries in the diary. A pattern became a story. In the hospital corridor, where the world seemed to move on the level of patience necessary for healing, 100 small things shifted. Sandra opened her eyes with a look of uncertainty that sometimes steadied into clarity. The nurses adjusted medications. Physical therapy began. Memory work with a psychologist was scheduled. Recovery was not a curve, but a staircase with missing steps. It required patience and presence. Carla's progress was less predictable. Memory returned in shards, songs, smells, the kitchen's tilt, which then gave way to fog. But she could hold on to Lara's face. She could remember that there had been a child she had loved so much that she had written the word "return" on the back of a photo. She could, with Ottavio's steady hand, walk the small ritual of saying the name aloud until it anchored in her mouth. The courtroom sequence unfolded over weeks, sometimes months, the kind of time that will stretch the nerves of everyone involved. Lara sat in the back with Ottavio and Mariana. She was the smallest person in a room, used to public dramas, and being small often has advantages. People underestimate you. The diary was presented, pages read. Witnesses told of seeing Carla leave with a small bundle and of a man who had followed. The gardener placed a dot in the map of time. This made the story three-dimensional. The chauffeur testified about a car that had not been logged by the family's official books. The old porter described a wallet that had been found in a trash bin near a market and later planted. Marcos' defense tried to reduce the diary to sentiment, to call memory unreliable. Amanda's lawyer insisted the transfers in question had been proper, that a plan to safeguard Sandra's assets had been made out of concern rather than greed. But then the nurse who had kept the photograph in her locker stepped forward. She held up the image and, with a voice that did not shake, said she had kept the photo because something about it felt like truth. "When Sandra's daughter came in," she said, "I felt the truth was heavier than the paperwork." Carla testified. She spoke of fear without painting it in gore. She spoke of leaving because she thought it was the only way to keep Lara alive. She talked about a man who claimed to be entitled to what he had not earned, affections, control, and the illusion of being indispensable. She said, in a tone that broke and then hardened, that she had been silenced for many years. The room leaned in as if to hear an echo of a life that had been cancelled. Lara waited for the questions that might make her feel like a curiosity. an anecdote to be turned into a line in a closing argument. Instead, the prosecutor asked her about the diary's line. If they ever try to take her, look under the loose floorboard. Had she been the one to find it? Had she ever seen how she belonged to the house beyond the paper? Lara answered in the way children answer heavy things, simply, honestly. She told them about the attic smell and the photograph, and about feeling protective in a way that had nothing to do with money. "You called me granddaughter," Sandra said, her voice thin but carrying through the room when the judge allowed her to speak. "She laughed at me and called me silly. I wanted her to have something real." Small admissions like this can be heavy. They tilt verdicts in ways that legal briefs cannot. When the verdict came, guilty on charges of conspiracy and fraud, and guilty on charges related to the attempt on Carla, the air in the courtroom seemed to compress. Marcos looked as if the ground had gone out from under him. Amanda wept beside him, not from sorrow but from the awareness that scripts had ended. Sentences were handed down in measured tones, time appropriate to the crimes, and restitution measures ordered toward repair. It would not restore the hours taken, but it would clear the legal field enough for people to rebuild. The judge spoke of truth as if it were a social duty. It would be money and barriers repaid, and an opportunity for some form of restitution. Outside the courthouse, cameras found the faces that fit their appetites. Sandra, flanked by doctors and with Ottavio at her side, pressed a hand to Lara's head in a quiet, public seal. Lara felt like the world had rearranged itself, not because the law had done everything, but because people had chosen to say what they knew. The larger acts of restoration came slower. There were negotiations about guardianship and a period when social services needed to be sure that Lara had a stable environment. The house, for all its temptations and memories, represented risk. But Sandra, with therapists and lawyers' counsel, signed a formal document made in a hospital room with witnesses and legal representatives that recognized Lara as her adopted granddaughter. Not a flash of legal magic, but a formal seam stitched with counsel and witnesses. The paperwork was not the promise. It was the sign that the promise would be recognized by systems that measure such things. For Lara, the moment felt smaller and larger than any document. Sandra had, in her small, steady way, chosen to say aloud what the world had called adopted in softer headlines. Legal acknowledgement followed, a public legitimacy that protected them from empty hands and predatory glances. It was not all joy. Sandra's recovery was like the rhythm of seasons, some days bright, some days grey. There were therapies and visits, a struggle with confusion that sometimes returned like bad weather. But the faces that visited her were fewer and truer. Carla came more often, her memory clearer in pieces. She could often tell a story about a day when Lara had laughed or when the house used to smell of oranges. Ottavio brought bread and the small, exact humor of a man who had watched too long for injustice. They built a life with a slow, domestic geometry, meals shared, small arguments about which radio station to keep on, the relearning of names. There was, in the middle of this reknitting, a small ceremony, private, not for cameras, held in the hospital garden. Sandra, still fragile but lucid enough to pronounce names like a vow, sat in a chair under a fig tree. The lawyer had drawn up papers. 2 nurses and Ottavio signed as witnesses. Carla, hair tied back, hands steadying with the work she had done in memory recovery, sat next to Lara. They called it an adoption in the legal sense, but for Lara it was a naming the heart had already made. Sandra pressed a rusted ring, a piece of family metal that had been kept in a drawer as if it were simply a paperweight, into Lara's small hand. "You are my granddaughter," she said. An old phrase, older than the legal text, landed on Lara like sunlight. Months later, when the house's dust had been cleared and the staff reconfigured, Lara returned to the attic with Carla and Ottavio to retrieve the diary and the trunk. They carried the trunk down into a kitchen that smelled of garlic and warmth. Carla opened it carefully, as if the objects had a breath. Inside were the small domestic things that stitched a life together: a child's mitten, a handkerchief, a grocery list in a slanted hand, a packet of photographs. They found among those things a wallet, the same one that had skittered in the rain months earlier. Inside was a small card that had belonged to a charity clinic, an appointment stamp, a short scribble on the back with a date. It did not solve all questions, but it anchored timelines. Carla smiled with a small, private victory and traced the loop of ink with a fingertip. They thought if they scattered the papers, time would forget her, she said. But paper remembers. Reparation had rooms beyond courtrooms. Amanda and Marcos had been stripped of offices and privileges. Restitutions began to flow into accounts designated by the court to assist Carla's recovery and to secure Lara's future. Money could not heal everything. It could not fix late nights or absent years. But it could buy stability, a place to sleep without watching the door, food that did not require barter, school books stacked like a promise. More important than money was trust. Trust was the small domestic currency that the new family minted. On a morning warm as bread, Carla and Ottavio were married in a small ceremony on a municipal green. A simple registration with a cake from the diner and a violinist who played poorly, but with heart. It was not a grand wedding. It required no orchestra. The guests were the people who had risked their names: Paulo, Rosa, Mrs. Figuera, the nurse Mariana, the inspector. Flowers from Paulo's cart decorated a folding table. The judge who had given the sentence came, not as an official, but as someone who understood the fragile geometry of justice. They ate cake and said small vows. Carla leaned into Ottavio, as if weight could be a form of comfort, and he stood, patient and amused at the ritual. Lara walked in a cardigan she had been given, and kept neat as a shrine. She watched Sandra, steady, a little slow, to make a toast with a glass of juice. The cameras did not follow them here. The small life did not want an audience. School was a chapter Lara met with the same blend of suspicion and hunger she had brought to every new thing. She learned to hold a pencil properly, to trade sandwiches and stories. She kept the ring in a small box at the bottom of her drawer, an old metal promise that fit like a pebble in her palm. She made friends who liked the way she told stories, spare, half something, with a laugh that came too soon for a city that counted losses. As the seasons turned, Sandra's clarity grew in blocks and then in smoothed planes. She sometimes forgot a name and then a week later remembered with a shame that made her apologize for the error. The psychologist explained that memory is not a river that flows back, it is a bed that can be cleared. She accepted the patience required for each small retrieval. One afternoon, sitting at a kitchen table that smelled of cinnamon, Sandra looked at Lara and, with a confidence born not only of recovery but of legal finality, took out the new will she had written, simple, clear, done with counsel present, and pointed to the line where Lara's name appeared as heir and adopted granddaughter. "That one," Sandra said, "that one will stay." There were visitors who came to see the face that the press used for months, patches of goodwill that fluttered like flags. People who had admired Sandra's generosity before now admired the family for its fortitude. Lara found these attentions awkward. She had once been invisible. Attention felt like a pressure. "What will you do when you're older?" Sandra asked her one evening, the two of them sitting on a small sofa in the living room, the lamp making a pool of light around their knees. Lara thought about the city, about the alleys, the corners with spare loaves, the people who had helped them like rocks in a river. She thought of the diary that had been a small, defiant anchor to prove they existed. "Maybe I'll open a place where other kids can come," she said. "Not a shelter that smells like hospitals, a place with a cooker that makes soup and someone who listens." Sandra's laugh was a soft thing. "You will make a kingdom out of small things," she said. "You already have." Time does funny things to memory. Events that had seemed like mountains became hills, small graces grew in size. A moment would emerge spontaneously, Lara dragging a chair to reach a high shelf for Sandra, Carla teaching her how to braid hair, Ottavio fixing a loose hinge, and they would all stop as if a camera had taken a picture. These were the frames they chose to live in. Months after the verdict, one morning, Lana walked into the study, where the old chest of drawers sat like a last, stubborn island of family. She found the leather-bound diary on the shelf, and on a whim that had the feel of ritual, she slid it out. The pages had been scanned for evidence and returned, but they felt softer now, like a thing that had been read enough to be loved. She flipped through the pages until she found a line she had memorized in the courtroom, a small italic sentence that had once been a beacon. If they ever try to take her, look under the loose floorboard. She smiled at the way the sentence had kept itself like a seed. On the desk, next to a brass lamp, lay a new envelope addressed in Sandra's careful hand. Lara opened it and found a small note and a train ticket. Time out to go somewhere they had never gone, a seaside town where the air did not hum with money. They would go together. The note was brief. For days when the house feels big, for new beginnings. On the morning they left, Lara stood at the gate and looked back once. The mansion was not the altar of fear it had once seemed. It was simply a house with windows that remembered loud laughter, pots on the stove, and the soft patter of small feet. She had once run from those windows. Now she walked through them. Before the taxi pulled away, she remembered the first thing she had done in the study that had started all of it. She had ripped a page and shouted a warning she did not know would matter. The memory came like the scratch of a match. "Stop!" she whispered to herself then, smiling at how that single moment had been a pivot. "Don't sign. It's a trap." Only now the phrase did not carry the same edge. It was an echo she held like a folded map. No longer a command to flee, but an invocation of the moment courage had chosen to arrive. The danger had been real, the victory messy. Justice had arrived not like a fanfare, but like a steady tide. In the months that followed, the family stitched small rituals into their days. They ate together, they argued about the thermostat, they went to the market and bought, shockingly, an extra loaf of bread for a neighbor who had once lent them sugar without a second thought. Lara, people sometimes misread her name, learned to read the diary out loud during storms, when memories like to come back as weather. Carla, sitting with a blanket over her knees, would close her eyes and listen like someone learning a language for the second time. On a late afternoon, when the sun slanted soft and long, Sandra sat with Lara on a small porch swing. The house behind them felt like furniture rather than a trap. Lara took Sandra's hand, which was warm, a little thin, but anchored. "You remember when you yelled?" Sandra asked, amused. Lara nodded. "I remember everything loud when I'm afraid." She leaned her head on Sandra's shoulder. "But not everything hurts." Sandra patted her knuckles. "Good. We keep what's important. We keep each other." They stayed there for a long time, watching a city that had been both cruel and kind move across its ordinary business. It would take more seasons for everything to settle. Therapies, time, small measures of trust. But they had what mattered. Names on a page that could not be erased, people who had risked their positions to tell the truth, a new legal paper that bore Lara's name as an adopted granddaughter, and a family knitted from imperfect threads. At night, when Lara put the rusted ring under her pillow, or when the diary lay open on the bedside table so she could read a line before sleep, she felt the pull of two lives. The one that had taught her to hide, and the one that showed her she could be seen. Both were true. Both lived inside her. Years later, walking home from school with a friend who loved to ask questions about everything, Lara pointed to a small storefront where a woman hung up hand-knitted scarves. "I want to open a place like that," she said. And her friend nodded, as if nothing could be more ordinary or more revolutionary. Lara had learned to do ordinary things fiercely. At the heart of that fierce ordinariness was a warning she had once shouted in a room of men and maps. It had been loud enough to topple a plan. It had been small enough to change a life. She found sometimes, when the world made a noise like a question mark, that she still used that voice, a small, clear instrument that had proven useful when the house wanted to close itself over truth. Not to tear paper anymore, not to run, but to protect a younger child who might one day stand in a doorway and discover a loose floorboard that kept a photograph. She would be there. The story did not conclude with dramatic resolution in the way movies like to show. There were still medical appointments and court dates regarding the division of assets, and Amanda appealed, as people do when pride is at stake. The past had not been wiped clean. There were nights when memory failed Sandra and filled the rooms with a silence that felt like absence. But those nights had companions now, voices, names, a legal pronouncement that bound the world to a gentler shape. One evening, some time after paperwork had sealed the adoption and the sentences had been carried out, Lara found herself in the study again. The room no longer felt like a cave of secrecy. It had become, in a way, a repository of things that could hurt and heal. She opened the same drawer where the pen had fallen months earlier, and with a small private ceremony, slid a clean pack of paper into the stack of family documents. She wrote a single line on the first page, for those who need a place to be remembered. As she closed the drawer, Sandra, leaning in the doorway with a shawl over her shoulders, called softly, "Come eat. The soup is almost ready." Lara smiled and made her way out, passing through thresholds that once had been traps. The house smelled like rosemary, and the world felt like a long, ordinary kindness. They sat at the table, a group made of reclaimed things. An adopted granddaughter, a mother who had returned, a man who had never stopped being steady, a nurse who had kept a photograph safe, and friends who had risked their names. They ate in a small way, the way people have their lives, with pauses, with laughter that sometimes started at nothing, and with hands reaching across plates. As the evening folded into itself, Sandra reached across the table and took Lara's hand. "You stopped them," she said, not as a child's boast, but as a truth that had cost more than it seemed. Lara squeezed back. "We stopped them," she corrected. "All of us." Outside, the city went on keeping its own hard ledger, but inside a small kitchen, reparation had been made, not only by courts, but by breakfast, by a ring passed into a tiny hand, by a diary that proved existence, and by daily acts of care that stitched edges back together. The title phrase, once a desperate cry, had become part of a map, leading not away from a family, but toward one. At the window, the photograph of Carla, smiling with a small, jam-smeared cheek, caught the evening light and threw it back into the room. It no longer had to shout the truth. The pieces of paper had done their work. The people had done theirs. Justice had moved as it could, and a child who had once learned to survive had learned how to belong. A week later, as they prepared for a small trip to the sea with sandwiches and a thermos and a towel tied around Lara's shoulders like a cape, Lara paused at the study's threshold. She touched the stack of legal documents, the diary, the ring, things that had been both weapons and talismans. The memory of that day, the shout, the tearing of paper, the scramble, lived like an ember under her ribs. She did not want to forget the taste of fear that had taught her to be brave, but she also knew bravery lived better when it kept company with care. "Ready?" Sandra called from the car, voice light as wind. Lara took one last look at the house that used to be a battleground and now felt like a home, with stitches in good places. She stepped out into the bright day, toward a future that would require work and steady courage, but that would be her own. As they drove away, the city unfolded like a map of choices. Lara watched the skyline and felt a quiet certainty. The words she had once cried, "Stop, don't sign, it's a trap," were no longer a single instrument of survival. They were a part of her story, a memory whose purpose had been fulfilled. Now when the phrase came back, it came accompanied by a new sentence: stay, build, protect. She smiled at the thought and reached, without looking, to slide the rusted ring back into her pocket. It fit there like a small promise. The past had shaped them, but it did not have the last line. They would write that together. If anyone asked her what victory looked like, she would say it was not the prison gates or the papers filed. It was the ordinary acts: a cup of tea handed without calculation, a door left unlocked for a friend, a child taught to read without being made to feel like an obligation. They had, in the end, reclaimed what had almost been taken. They had named it, defended it and protected it. Lara had shouted once and changed the course of many lives. That moment had been a hinge. The rest, the slow, often quiet work of repair, was the true story. When the car turned toward the blue smear of ocean, Lara pressed her forehead to the cool glass and whispered to herself and to the long memory of a room where paper had been torn, "We sign different things now." She let the words be a benediction, small and steady as bread. The sea ahead gleamed like a promise, and the day, soft, ordinary, and full of promise, unfolded. The trap had been stopped. A family had been found.